fuse triggers the irreversible thermite reaction. As scorching hot meets freezing cold, a fierce battle rages. The smoke clears, and incredibly, nothing remains. As the thermite burns at 2,500 degrees, it releases a raging torrent of molten iron, which rains down upon the liquid nitrogen, boiling the glacial mixture away in a plume of vapour and melting the cylinder, leaving just a puddle of white-hot iron. A clear victory for thermite. So there you go, Dan. Adding something cold to thermite doesn't cancel it out. It just makes it angry.
I'm sure that they clear the area, but that's a small one.
He's gonna bring in the big one. No, this is soon enough.
Okay. I studied physics at MIT. I did electrical engineering for about 8 years. I've had quite a bit of practical engineering experience. When I first saw the collapses, I was absolutely convinced that they were not spontaneous. One of the first things that I did was to speak with one of my patients, who is a retired Army Corps of Engineers fellow who's done a lot of demolition and construction. Showed him some of the public source videos that are available of it, and he immediately pointed out that there were squibs, which represent little puffs of smoke essentially coming out of the buildings initially, which were clearly a sign of controlled demolition. He had no opinions beyond that, but he said without doubt that it was controlled demolition. That sort of set me on the path of continuing to examine it and trying to gather as much evidence as I could. You know, the obvious question is what does it mean that there was a controlled demolition? At the simplest level, it means that someone had a lot of access to the buildings over a long enough period of time to set this up. The initial FEMA report basically acknowledged that the kerosene would have burned off very quickly. What wasn't destroyed in the initial fireball would have been consumed fairly rapidly and would have only really served as an ignition for the rest of the material. And the second point being that the fuel here really was strictly office contents. If you think of a modern office with copying machines, computers, and as has been previously mentioned, the smoke, particularly from Building 2, just before it collapsed, was very black looking. This is generally an indication of an inefficient fire in which there's not enough oxygen for the amount of fuel. These types of fires typically burn very cool. They are not hot flames like blowtorches. The cores themselves, basically, if you've seen diagrams of the building, there's a large central rectangle in each of the towers that contained 47 columns. And these columns basically were the primary structural support of the building. They were given the role of supporting the whole gravitational load of the building. Since they were so strong, it would have been reasonable to think that they would have withstood, at least to some extent, the collapse. But in fact, as we see after the buildings collapsed, there was basically only little stubs of these things standing up a floor or two above the ground level. The cores did not have much in them that would burn. The cores basically were dedicated to things like elevator shafts, utility shafts, stairways. So you have drywall material, you have a little bit of carpeting, you don't really have any inflammable material in the core itself. Okay, as far as the issue of what failed and how, some of the initial suggestions, and these showed up in the NOVA documentary, which is a good example of what I like to call proof by computer animation. Thomas Egar, who was a material scientist but not a structural engineer, who became a spokesman for these documentaries, indicated that the floors had somehow failed, that the trusses supporting the floors had failed. This was the theory that was put forward actually in the initial FEMA report. Subsequently, there have been basically complete contradictions of that. Jim Hoffman has done quite a bit of research which is available on the web concerning the problems with this idea that the floors would have simply fallen. There was a study done by Weidlinger Associates. The chief engineer there was Mathis Levy, who's a very well-known authority on building collapses. He specifically disavowed the idea of pancaking or collapsing of the floors. And the most recent official report we have on this, which is from National Institutes of Standards and Technology, NIST, rejected the idea that floor collapse was part of it. And so as a result, we have basically no sequential model at this point. What NIST has suggested is that there was some kind of simultaneous collapse of the cores, but they have not attempted to give any kind of modeling as to whether those cores could have in fact been destroyed by the fires in the way that they claim. Unfortunately, the material that would have allowed a detailed fire analysis, the actual physical evidence, is all gone. One of the most significant things to my thinking that indicates that this could not have been the sort of collapse that we are told it was is the presence of the dust clouds. And as you've seen in the pictures, and I'm sure all of us have seen probably more than we would like, there were very, very large clouds of very thick dust that enveloped the area, that crossed the river, that made it almost all the way to New Jersey from the pictures that I've seen. This type of flow is something that we are familiar with in physics. It occurs in only two situations that we know of naturally. One is in volcanic eruptions where a large amount of material is suddenly exploded into the air and basically forms small particles. The other situation is something called turbidity currents. These occur along the edges of the continental shelves where mud or sediment will slump, become suspended in water. And the common thread is that you have large amounts of a dense material that is suspended very quickly in a fluid, thereby creating another denser fluid, which is in effect the dust cloud. And that fluid can achieve considerable velocities. The problem with creating this sort of slurry of fine particles is that there really is no mechanism that has been proposed. We have concrete floors with carpeting or flooring over them. We have furniture. We have floors basically that are coming together in a collapse, but the concrete is basically protected under these layers. Early in the collapse, in the very first moments, we see these thick clouds being ejected at very high speed. They're clearly dense because they flow downward and become part of this large overall pyroclastic flow. What we're basically being told is that the concrete sort of jumped up into midair, exploded itself, and then was ejected as the floors came together. Not a very